In today's video, I'm going to talk more about critical thinking and specifically how we can improve our audit results by thinking more critically, right? And actually, excuse me, utilizing some of these critical thinking skills. And it's one of the areas where I know a lot of people, they think, oh, well, I think critically. I'm a good auditor. I do things, very logically. I don't have any issue with this. But the reality is, most people make some mistakes when it comes to thinking critically. There's certain biases that come in. There's certain classic kind of decision making uh, errors or pitfalls that we fall into. And internal auditors are no different than anyone else. In fact, we all like to think that we think critically. We all think that we think critically. But the reality is, we could all do a better job because there are often blind spots and biases that creep in that we don't even realize. And so today, I just want to go through and talk a little bit more about some practical ways that you can avoid some of these pitfalls. And in so doing, it'll help you to make better decisions and improve the effectiveness of the audit results that you're doing as well. Now, this week, I was actually teaching a lot of these concepts to one of the local IIA chapters. It was actually about a 2 to 2.5 hour training that we did on critical thinking and professional skepticism. And I've taught this several times online to different groups. And eventually I will end up getting it recorded, probably end up being, I'm not sure, but at least a 3 hour or 4 hour training on critical thinking and professional skepticism. So that's to come, but I wanted to share some of the information in the meantime before I have the opportunity to get that recorded. So here we go. Now, there are some classic reasons why we don't think critically, and I'm just going to highlight a couple of them really quick here to kind of show how we can combat those. Okay. And I've done videos before about how critical thinking skills are declining. And again, most of us would like to shake our head and think, no, they're not. But the scientific research shows otherwise. It shows that the more educated we're getting, and the more knowledgeable we believe we are, we're actually not critically thinking. We're just accepting a lot of the things that we're being told today, which is ironic. Okay. Now, one of the big areas, and we're not going to get into all of them today, but something that creeps in is the different biases. Okay. And there's lots of different biases. Like I said, I'll go into that in more detail in the future on what some of those are and how we can avoid some of those. But today I thought I would use as an example confirmation bias. In confirmation bias, what that means is that we tend to find evidence to support the decision that we want to make. So, we've decided what we think the answer is, and now we go out and we find evidence to support what we think the correct answer is supposed to be. And again, this is classic. You can do research online about it. It's one of the classic biases that we all engage in each day because we tend to view the world the way we view it. We tend to make kind of split second unconscious decisions and then try to find data to support consciously what we believe it is. Okay. And like I said, this happens to all of us. It happens to me. But there's ways that we need to kind of be thinking about this to make sure that we don't fall into the pitfall of just collecting data that supports what we already think. Now, there's a classic audit testing approach called analytical review. And, some people may still use it. I know it's kind of old school, but it's a good test when done correctly. And so typically, when a lot of people think of analytical review, they start with the client number, and then they kind of justify why that number is correct. That's not actually how you do an analytical review test. And I'm gonna explain. I'm gonna walk through this because this is going to help us to kind of understand and remove that confirmation bias from our work. So, in the old days, I'm just going to use a public accounting financial reporting example because it's easy for people to understand. So, if an external auditor would go into a client, they would, be looking and doing some tests to make sure, and in this case, we're going to use interest expense because it's easy. They want to make sure that interest expense on the income statement is accurate. It's materially correct, right? And so one of the testing steps that would often be done is what's called analytical review. Now, most auditors, when they would do analytical review, they would look at, okay, the client has $1 million in interest expense. Oh, how much debt did they have? Yeah, that seems about right. That's about this percentage of interest on all their debt. That's probably about right. We give that a thumbs up, right? Now, that's what a lot of people would do for analytical review. But that is a way of confirmation bias coming into it, right? Because what you're doing is you're presuming that the number is correct from the client, and now you are finding data to justify that number. The way analytical review testing is supposed to be done is the auditor calculates what they believe interest expense should be, and then they compare that with what the client has recorded and see if they are materially close. And so instead of doing kind of the, finger to the wind, yeah, that seems about right, what you would do instead, if you were actually doing an analytical review, is you would look at, okay, well, interest expense is usually caused by what? By debt, right? Short-term and long-term debt. And so if I have an understanding of what the client's debt balances were throughout the year, I can determine what I believe a reasonable rate of interest that would be charged on something like credit cards, revolving lines of credit, long-term debt, if they have bonds, the different kinds of whatever debt they end up having. And so I would calculate maybe an average balance throughout the year. I would apply what I deem to be a good interest number. So, for example, maybe most people for commercial loans are paying 6.5%, whatever the number happens to be in the marketplace. And I would multiply the client's balances by that interest rate. I would calculate what I think the interest expense for the year would be. I'd add it all up, and I would come up with something, let's say, of $950,000. I would say, okay, so $950,000 is what I think the client should have in interest expense. What do they actually have? $1 million. 950 versus $1 million, it's probably close enough, right? At that point, it's probably materially correct. But hopefully you can see the difference in the way and the critical thinking steps that help remove the confirmation bias when you do analytical review the correct way. If you try to back into it, then you're allowing confirmation bias to be there. Okay? So that's one kind of concrete example. So let me go through now and talk about some of the different ways to improve your critical thinking. And guess what? Number one is remove your biases. Okay? Understand what some of the different biases may be that you could fall into. There's many of them, things like groupthink, and on and on and on and on, right? But, take a look at your biases and think about which biases you may be subject to, and then what are some ways in which you can reduce those biases? Well, one that I just talked about with that example right, is actually, not trying to back into or trying to find data based on a preconceived conclusion you have, but waiting to make a conclusion until you have actually done the analysis, right? That's going to help reduce your confirmation bias. Now, another way for you to help lower your biases is to have other people involved. And so, again, groupthink is one of the confirmation biases, so you have to be careful. But you would want to make sure and maybe collaborate or corroborate what you're doing with other people and other people who have different backgrounds, different ways of thinking, so that you're not all then going into the groupthink bias. And so as an example, like I shared with the analytical review, maybe you'd have two different people independently come up with what they think their own calculation should be. And maybe I calculate 950 and Jane on the team, calculates 1.1 million. Okay. And then we can look at it and say, okay, well, this is how I calculated it. How did you calculate it? Are there things we can learn maybe from each other? And maybe we find a third way of doing it that seems more accurate, right? And so corroborating and collaborating with people is one of the ways to help reduce our biases. Okay. Now, it's not just in that way, but we can also corroborate research and actually try to go back to primary source data. And so this is one of the biggest traps that a lot of people are falling into today from a critical thinking perspective is they're not going back to primary source data. Instead, they're going to secondary or tertiary data, which is somebody's opinion about things that they have read, or maybe if they have or have not actually looked at the primary research. And so, how does that relate to us in audit? Well, it's the same kind of thing, right? We want to try to go back and get the best evidence that we can. So as an example, right, if we're maybe looking at a system report for a basis of data that we're using, okay, that's good. But is that data accurate? Have we done something to ensure that the data that we're relying on in the report is actually telling us what we think it's telling us? And is it actually calculated accurately? Right? So it requires us often to go back one more step than we normally would. But if we don't do that, right, we may be thinking that the report says apples, but the report actually says oranges. And so if we're using it and we, incorrectly, we're going to end up making an incorrect assumption, conclusion, and result in our audit as well. So wanting to make sure and try to go back to primary sources, right? Not just what people say. So again, one of the common audit testing steps is called inquiry. It's interviewing people. It's asking them questions, right? And it's a very valid and very useful, in fact, it's probably one of the most frequent audit tests that's performed. But hopefully you've been told this, but maybe you haven't. But even though inquiry is an audit testing step, right, there's a caveat. Inquiry alone is insufficient. Inquiry alone is insufficient, meaning I can't just rely on a secondary source to make my conclusion completely. I need to somehow corroborate, validate, or do some other testing method that actually helps to substantiate what I am hearing through my inquiry. That's an example in audit of kind of going back to a primary source or corroborating that secondary source with something else. Okay. Now, let's switch a little bit and talk about some of the things that you may not even think would relate to critical thinking, but they do. One of the reasons why people have difficulty critically thinking is they're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, rushed. Okay. And so I'm going to talk about that. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. First off, right? Halt. Hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Anytime we are hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, our cognitive abilities go down, and we are more likely to make an error in judgment. We're more likely to make a bad decision. We're more likely to say things we didn't mean to say, to buy things we didn't mean to buy, as an example, right? And so, one of the things that my mother taught me when I was very young is you don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry. Now, why would she say that? Don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry. Well, because when you're hungry and you walk through the grocery store, all of a sudden you're desiring and wanting everything. And because you're hungry, your willpower goes down. And so before you know it, when you leave the grocery store, you have 2 to 3 times as many things as you planned to go in for. You get home, you don't eat half of them anyway, right? And that's just kind of a basic example about hungry. But, when you think about, maybe if you have a partner or friends or family, when are the times that you have a disagreement with them? When are the times when you might argue with them, when you may become angry? Often it's when we're tired or when we're already angry, right? So if you're trying to make a decision, if you're trying to do audit work and you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, right, you're probably not going to make the best decision. Now, let's talk about the tired, okay? Because most people, especially in the US, do not get as much sleep as they need. Most people work way more than 40 hours a week. They have long commutes. Um, if they're still working from an office or having to go someplace, they have personal commitments, maybe kids or elderly parents, and so a lot of people don't get the amount of rest that they need. Now, every person is different, but on average, and again, this is scientifically proven, most people usually need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep a night for them to be able to function properly. So, how much sleep are you getting? If you're trying to get by on 4 hours of sleep a night or 5 or 6 hours, eventually it's going to catch up to you because the more tired you are, again, the harder it is to have your cognitive abilities, the harder it is for you to critically think, right? And so, especially, a practical way of doing this, I understand being tired. Okay. There's some nights that I don't sleep very well. And so I just have to be careful when I am tired about what decisions I do or what I do from a work perspective. So for example, if it's late at night and I'm tired and I'm kind of wrapping up a project, okay, or I'm getting back to a client about something, I've kind of wrapped up the work, I don't send it off at night because I'm tired and there's a good chance I've made a mistake. And so I will instead wait until the next morning when I feel less tired, more awake, go back and double check what I've done. And often there are things that maybe I should have said differently. Maybe I forgot something, my spreadsheet wasn't calculating correctly. I don't know, whatever, right? But I catch those things before they end up going out. And so it's the same thing in audit, right? If you're tired, don't complete something or come up with the results when you're tired. Try to do it at a time instead when you have more of your cognitive function. Okay. Another thing that kind of goes along with that is cognitive skills go down, critical thinking goes down when we are rushed, when we're rushed to make a decision. Now, there's a fine balance between being rushed and never making a decision. Okay. And in the middle there is where the real critical thinking actually happens. Because if you're never making a decision, you're actually never coming to a conclusion. You're never actually critically deciding anything. If you rush to make a decision, then often you end up falling into some of these pitfalls. Maybe there's a bias you haven't thought about. Maybe there was another source of information that you should have gathered one or two more sources of information or done one or two more corroborative tests to make sure that the results that you're gonna be presenting or the conclusions you're going to present are actually accurate, right? And so that's another practical thing. If you're being rushed to do something, try to slow down a little bit to make sure that you're actually making the right decision. If you're tired, don't try to finish everything right away. Don't try to make those important decisions and conclusions when you're tired. Okay. Now, another one for today. Like I said, I'll probably have to do a few videos on this. But here's another one that most people don't think about. I talked about corroborating maybe with other people, corroborating with other information or data sources. Again, trying to go back primary as much as you can. But if you can't get to the primary, at least if you're corroborating several different secondary sources, that's better than only relying on one secondary source. But another thing we can do is actually check in with ourselves. And you may not realize this because we like to think that all of the thinking happens up here in our gray matter in our brain, in our prefrontal cortex, but it actually doesn't. And believe me, don't believe me, that's up to you, but you can go do research. But there's a thing called three brains. There's three brains in human beings. Now, the only one we talk about is the one that's between our ears and behind our eyes, right? Our physical, what we call our brain. And most of, again, our consciousness, our analytical reasoning is done in the prefrontal cortex of our brain. But there's also our heart and our gut. And so a lot of people, and again, it's been taught actually in ancient traditions for forever. There's scientific research on it now as well that shows that in fact we do make decisions and we do think in our head, in our heart, and in our gut, but they're in a different way. And so one of the reasons why we make some of the critical thinking errors we do is we don't allow ourselves to go into our heart and to go into our gut to check ourselves, to do a gut check, right? There's a reason that's a term in the English language. Oh, I'm going to do a gut check on that. Okay, so what does that mean? Especially for some of you that maybe English is not your first language. What it means is something like this. Somebody says something, or you decide to make a decision, or you're going to do this, or you're not going to do this, and all of a sudden you get a sick feeling in your stomach. Well, do we listen to that sick feeling in our stomach, or do we ignore it? And if you think about your life, anytime that you've decided to do something, or maybe somebody has told you something and you believe them, you believe it's true, but you got a sick feeling in your gut, how did it turn out? And most of the time, the things that we feel in our heart and the things that we feel in our gut are actually more accurate than our head. Now, because we're more educated, we like to believe that our brain makes us so much different and is so much better than everything else. But I will tell you, our heart and our gut have been helping us as humans for millions of years, okay? Helping us to survive. And let me give you a little story about this at the end here, because I know there's some people, especially in risk management and others, that say, never trust your gut. Always go with your head. It needs to be analytical and logical. That doesn't make sense most of the time. And I'm going to share just a quick example. Is let's say that we're all a part of a ancient civilization where we're sitting in a cave with a fire and we're all getting hungry. And somebody needs to go out and find something to eat. But it's starting to get dark. And so we know that there's dangers outside of the cave. And so we sit down as a group and we logically, analytically come up with. We look at maybe the migration routes of saber-toothed tigers and the correlation between weather patterns and whether the animals are out roaming or if they're taking cover. We look at the number of them and come up with all these different data points. We create a spreadsheet. We could even create a Monte Carlo simulation, whatever you want to call it. Some sort of analytics to take this historical data that we know and come up with a probability, right? Because nobody wants to go outside because they're afraid to get eaten and killed, okay? But we're going to analytically decide, should we go outside or not? Because our stomachs need food. And so we go through, we calculate all this stuff, and we come up with it. And at the end of the day, we say, oh, well, on tonight, there's only a 4.7% chance that if somebody goes outside the cave, they're actually going to die. And we've calculated the statistical probabilities. We've created an analytical model for it. And yes, we know that it's plus or minus 2%. So it could be as high as 6.7%, but hey, it may only be 2.7% too. And so as a group, we decide, okay, well, that's probably a risk we're willing to take. Analytically, that sounds good to us. And so we go around and we draw straws. And somebody, we'll call him Jason or Bob or Sue, draws the straw, and they're the person who gets to go outside. Now, what do you think their stomach is telling them? Boo, no way. I don't want to be the one to go outside. I remember last week, the other person went out, they didn't come back, right? I don't want to be the one that goes out. And we stop and we say, yeah, but Jason, look, analytically, right? Analytically, we've gone through this whole exercise. We've got all this data. We've calculated models on it. We've done statistical analysis on it, and logically, analytically, right? We've critically thought about this, and the decision is somebody needs to go outside and get food. Look, it's only a 4.7% chance. But in my gut, I feel like that's not the right thing to do. Even though we've gone through all the classical, critical thinking processes, we've got good data, we've validated it with other people. At the end of the day, right, what does your gut tell you to do? Because even at 4.7% chance, would you go outside of the cave? Even though logically and analytically, that's telling you what the answer should be? I don't know. Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But checking in with our heart and checking in with our gut and seeing how we feel about certain things can be a very, very valuable tool for us to help corroborate and make sure that we're making good critical thinking decisions. Now, on the flip side, you may make the decision, you check in with your heart. Yeah, it feels good. I'm not getting any sick feeling in my stomach. That can also corroborate the decision you're making, right? I just used an example where it's like, no, don't rely on that decision, but it can go the other way as well. So I'm going to wrap up for today. But again, those are kind of some practical ways that you can improve your critical thinking, and it'll help you make better decisions. It'll also help you provide better audit results because the conclusions that you're making, the way you're testing, the way you're summarizing and coming up with the conclusions will be better as well. So I'll see you on the next video.